You're watching The Legal Breakdown. So, Glenn, the Colorado trial is now underway to remove Donald Trump from the ballot under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which disqualifies anyone who engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the Constitution after taking an oath to support it. Now, first of all, Trump had made multiple attempts to actually dismiss this case without a trial, all of which failed. So, what does that say?
You know, it says that the 4 or 5 legal motions that Donald Trump's lawyers filed trying to do away with the trial altogether failed, one after another. So at this moment, it is going to come down to a factual determination, at least with respect to the Colorado judge who is presiding over this trial. She is sitting, she's hearing all the evidence, and she's going to have to decide as a matter of fact if Donald Trump engaged in insurrection or gave aid and comfort to the insurrection. So now the witnesses are coming in one after another to talk about what Donald Trump did on and around January 6th. But the fact that all of the legal motions were denied by the trial judge is actually a pretty ominous sign for Donald Trump, because she culled out all the legal issues. And now we're in the meat of the factual presentation. And based on some of the reporting, it is one heck of a factual presentation.
Okay, so building on exactly that, do you have any update on the case as it stands right now?
Yeah, so the case was brought by an organization called CREW, Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. Sounds like a pretty important mission. They brought suit on behalf of several Colorado voters, and they are now publishing daily updates on their website, and they're cataloging what some of the witnesses have been saying. So, for example, police officer Daniel Hodges testified. He's the one that we saw sort of that horrific photo of with his head caught between the doors and the insurrectionist sort of squeezing his head in that door. He testified about the horrific circumstances that he suffered, that he endured, the assaults. Somebody, not to get too graphic, but one of the insurrectionists took his own nightstick and tried to use it to gouge his eye out. He talked about how they were so dramatically outnumbered that day. So he really brought the full horror of what those Trump supporters did at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th to the judge's attention. Congressman Eric Swalwell then testified. He gave the perspective from inside the Capitol. He talked about being down on the floor, having to scramble to get the gas masks that are hidden up underneath the representatives' desks. He remembers prayers being said. He remembers texting his wife frantically because he didn't know if he was going to make it out alive. So Swalwell brought the perspective of the lawmakers to the attention of the judge, what they experienced inside the chamber as they heard the yells and the screams and the banging on the chamber's door as the insurrectionists were trying to breach the chamber. And then he talked about how they were sort of whisked out of there by officers to safety, basically in the nick of time.
Now, Glenn, there are going to be cases across the country seeking either to remove Donald Trump from ballots that he's already been added to, or to add Donald Trump to ballots that he's been removed from. So will we see analogous cases in states across the country, or will this Colorado case be the case that litigates this issue?
Well, this will be the first case, but there are other cases in the works. So I suspect what's going to happen, Brian, is lots and lots of states will have legal challenges brought to whatever it is they decide. If a Secretary of State, for example, decides to put Donald Trump's name on the presidential ballot, then there will be legal challenges brought saying, listen, the Constitution says somebody who engages in insurrection is constitutionally disqualified, so his name can't be on the ballot. So a suit will be brought to challenge that decision. If the Secretary of State opts to leave Donald Trump's name off the ballot, then suits will be filed saying, hey, that's election interference. His name should be on the ballot because there really is no showing that he engaged in or gave aid and comfort to the insurrection. So you're going to have lots of legal challenges brought, I think, regardless of which way each state goes with respect to putting on or leaving off Donald Trump's name. And I do think Colorado will be the first of many, but it's going to kind of set the tone, because I think CREW, the organization that brought the suit in Colorado, is putting its best evidentiary foot forward, and they're really going to try to present lots and lots and lots of compelling evidence about how Donald Trump really did organize, incite, engage in, assist, and give aid and comfort to the insurrection. Those are each slightly different things, and we can talk about how Donald Trump actually did each one of those things.
Well, does it almost not matter what the outcome is in this case in Colorado, since it's becoming more and more clear that the Supreme Court will be the final arbiter of this decision?
You know, it matters. Here's why it matters. Because the Supreme Court will have to look at the evidentiary record that was developed during the course of the suit. And that's why I think it's important that Crew is bringing a very strong evidentiary case. They're going to put on lots of witnesses. They're going to develop the factual record. And then it is that factual record that will be handed off to the appellate court, first the appellate courts in Colorado, but then ultimately it will jump into the federal jurisdiction, and it will be decided by the Supreme Court.
Now, do you have any indication as to how long this may take? I mean, we're already, the hard part is usually just getting to trial. Trial's already begun here. So can you tell us what the timeline is looking like from the beginning of this trial, which is where we are now, to the appeals process, to ultimately the Supreme Court? And obviously this has to be done before the election, so we're looking at an expedited timeline regardless.
Not only before the election, but the judge in Colorado said she's going to hold a 1-week trial, and then she's going to announce her ruling pretty promptly, because there's a deadline for names to go on the presidential ballots that have to be printed up in the state of Colorado. I forget precisely the date of the deadline. It's sometime in November or early December. So she said, listen, she's going to decide this issue promptly so it can then move to the appellate court. I have a feeling the appellate court will absolutely put it on an expedited track, because this is something that's going to have to be resolved as we get closer and closer to the primaries.
And do you have any indication as to how the Supreme Court may rule, or is this all just so unprecedented that it's not even worth guessing here?
Oh, it's worth guessing. It's always worth guessing. Here's what I would say about my view of the Supreme Court and how they may approach this question. First of all, we know that the block of conservative justices, 6 of them, they sort of rule the roost now. They love the strict construction of the Constitution, don't they? They are forever blathering on about the intent of the framers of the Constitution. They brag about how they are originalists. Well, guess what? The language, the express language of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment says, if you engaged in or gave aid and comfort to an insurrection after you took an oath to support and defend the Constitution, you are disqualified, period. Original intent, the express language of the Constitution, it's all there, right? It should more than satisfy the Supreme Court, the conservative Supreme Court justices, that Donald Trump is disqualified, provided the evidence establishes he engaged in, incited, assisted, or gave aid and comfort to the insurrection, which he did. The evidence is there in boatloads. So if they want to remain, loyal to what they're always spouting off about the express words of the Constitution and the original intent of the framers, then they're going to have everything they need to affirm the lower court opinion, assuming this is the opinion that Donald Trump is disqualified. But there's a second reason. I think the Supreme Court will find every way they can to refuse to put Donald Trump back in the Oval Office. And it's not because I believe they actually have any allegiance to the Constitution. It's because I believe they are entirely motivated by their own self-preservation, by their supreme status. Here's why I say that, Brian. If they do anything to enable an aspiring dictator to return to the Oval Office, Donald Trump has already said he will cancel the Constitution. Well, you know who has absolutely no use for a Supreme Court? A dictator. So if they were to reinstall Donald Trump in the Oval Office, one of the first things he might do is just go ahead and do away with the Supreme Court or marginalize them in the way dictators do. We've seen that around the world recently. Efforts by an aspiring dictator or a de facto dictator to do away with the judiciary. So I think that's another reason, not because of their, allegiance to the Constitution, but another reason the Supreme Court justices might say we are not going to be part of reinstalling a dictator in the Oval Office, because then he may do away with or sort of marginalize our supreme status.
All right, let's finish off with this. And I feel like I know what the answer to this question is going to be. But Glenn, in your opinion, should Donald Trump be disqualified based on Section 3 of the 14th Amendment? And how do you take into account the Republican claim that it should be the voters who decide on a candidate and not the courts?
Yeah, so let me take on that second part first. Donald Trump's lawyer argued that disqualifying him from a presidential ballot would be anti-democratic. If irony were still a thing, if the Republican Party hadn't killed irony a very long time ago, irony has decomposed into dust at this point. If it were still a thing, it would be ironic that the president who tried to override the express will of the American voters and reinstall himself in the presidency for a second term is screaming that it's somehow anti-democratic if the Constitution is followed and he is disqualified because he engaged in insurrection. Setting that aside, how do I think, do I think that the evidence, that the facts support the conclusion that he engaged in insurrection? Let's tick through it really quickly. This was Donald Trump's insurrection from start to finish. We have to start on September 29th, 2020, when during the presidential debate with Joe Biden, he expressly told the insurrectionists to stand back and stand by, the Proud Boys. The Proud Boys were some of the insurrectionists on January 6th. Let's fast forward to the date he set for the Capitol attack. He tweeted out on December 19th, 2020, big protest in D.C. Come to D.C. on January 6th, will be wild. He set the date for the insurrection. On January 6th, his early morning speech on the ellipse, what I call his pre-insurrection pep rally, he ginned the crowd up and incited them. How? By lying to them about their vote being stolen, their election being rigged, their favorite president being unlawfully taken from them. None of that was true. He then gave the order to attack. He said, fight like hell or you won't have a country anymore. Go to the Capitol and stop the certification. He used the word steal. Stop the steal. So he actually launched the insurrection. Then he assisted the insurrection while it was in progress. How? We heard testimony about people streaming in to the dining room that's adjacent to the Oval Office saying, please call off the attack. We heard testimony during the January 6th House Select Committee hearings that he said, no, my supporters aren't wrong. Mike Pence had it coming, and he tweeted out, Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what he should have done. In other words, install me for a second term. So he assisted the insurrection while it was in progress. And finally, he told them at the end of the day, when things were calming down at the U.S. Capitol, you're very special. We love you. And ever since, he has been pledging to pardon insurrectionists. You know, pledging your love and saying you will pardon insurrectionists is giving aid and comfort to the insurrection and the insurrectionists, just as sure as I'm sitting here. So, Brian, he actually checks off every single box. He incited the insurrection. He engaged in insurrection. He assisted the insurrection. He gave aid and comfort to the insurrection and the insurrectionists. If the judge sitting in Colorado, it's Judge Sarah Wallace, is an honest broker of the facts and the law, I have no reason to believe she's not. She will absolutely conclude Donald Trump engaged in insurrection and is disqualified constitutionally from ever holding public office again. That is what I expect to see coming out of this Colorado trial.
Well, there's nothing to add. You laid that out perfectly, and a compelling case it is. So obviously we'll stay on top of this case as it continues to play out, but it's going to move pretty quickly because, as you mentioned before, we have a deadline to abide by in terms of when names can be put on the ballot. So we'll definitely be on top of this case in particular as it continues to progress. So for anybody watching, if you want to stay on top of this case among the others, make sure to subscribe. The links are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Teller Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.